When I first read this comment on my Mirror's Edge video talking about how they used to play it on their iPad when they were little, I dismissed it as someone misremembering or misattributing memories to the Mirror's Edge series. I mean, how the
Fudge.
could a iPad run Mirror's Edge? But this comment kept picking at my brain, so I decided to do some digging and I found out that it actually exists. Kinda. And also that there was an officially supported Flash game made by the creator of Fancy Pants? But more on that one later. So join me as we go 13 years back in time to 2010 when Facebook was still cool and killing hill giants and grinding woodcutting still seemed like a good use of my free time. Developed by Iron Monkey Studios, who would later work on other EA mobile titles like The Sims Mobile and several Need for Speed games, Mirror's Edge Mobile is a side-scrolling platformer released for the iPad and iPhone. Unfortunately, EA dropped support for the game as Apple moved towards 64-bit apps, and it was ultimately pulled from the App Store in 2015. But according to some threads I found, you might still be able to play it if you have an old iPhone or Windows phone and are willing to go through the process of finding the proper files and then sideloading them. I don't have a phone able to do this though, so I want to give a big shout out to Long Play Express for letting me use their footage of the game. Their channel is all about archiving footage from old mobile games which are often no longer available, which is awesome because it helps stop pieces of gaming history from being forgotten and helps videos like this one be made. Their channel is linked in the description, check it out. The story mode has 14 different levels taking place just before the main game, basically serving to help flesh out the lore and set up the world some more. The player uses the touchscreen to control Faith, like swiping left or right to change her direction, swiping up to jump, wall run, and grab ziplines, swiping down to slide and skill roll, and so on. Avoiding obstacles allows you to build speed, and when you slide or zipline, you can tilt your device to go faster, which I'm sure was very impressive back in 2010. Mirror's Edge Mobile even has a rudimentary combat system that lets you take down enemies in several ways. For instance, you can do sliding or jumping attacks and also disarm opponents by swiping in the same direction that you're already moving. There are also collectibles like runner's bags scattered throughout the levels that serve as a sort of side objective. In terms of the story, the presentation is too text heavy, as it's just told through the scrolling news panels that you'd see in the elevators in the first game. In my video on the first game, I criticized the cartoon-style cutscenes, but I think they would have actually worked well here, as of course I don't expect excellent 3D rendered cutscenes in a mobile game from 2010. But maybe that just wasn't in the budget. So I'll give you the TLDR on these massive Reddit-style walls of text so that you don't have to read through it. It centers on the conflict between Robert Pope, you know, this guy, and his rival Senator Callaghan as they both compete to be the mayor of the city. As someone who participated in the November riots and was a friend of Faith's parents, Pope supports the runners as one of the only remaining bastions of free speech in the city. Obviously, in a regime that's quickly becoming authoritarian, this is going to make a lot of dangerous enemies, like Elaine Callaghan, who is trying to consolidate her grip over the city. She's an unseen character throughout the series, but is sometimes implied to be the one pulling the strings at the top. Mirror's Edge Mobile gives us a better idea of who she is and how she helped to bring about the current state of the city that we see in the main games. Callaghan trains fake runners to commit attacks all over the city and then uses her control over the media to demonize both the runners and paint the city's police force as incompetent for being able to stop them. This paves the way for her to replace the police with her own private army, the security company Pirandello Kruger, or PK, that we see in the original Mirror's Edge. The story pretty much ends right before the start of the main game, with a note from Callaghan mentioning making the necessary arrangement for C's meeting with Pope, referring to Celeste unaliving him in the main game, as well as name-dropping Project Icarus. It's a relatively simple story, but for what it is, I appreciate the extra lore and setup for the main game. Should you play this game for the story? No. But if you actually care, I've linked a Reddit post containing the entire script in the description. Mirror's Edge Mobile also featured several other modes. The first is Speedrun, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just a mode where you can replay the campaign missions, trying to get the best time. It also features two local multiplayer modes, Race Mode and Rival Mode. They're both split screens, so you and your partner would place the iPad between you and each get half of the screen. These modes were sadly only available on the iPad version, as trying to play split screen on an iPhone would, well, obviously not be a great time. Also, with the way it's set up on the iPad, it normally looks like this in the recordings, so I've edited the footage like this to make it a little easier to follow for the rest of this section. Also, if you're liking the video so far, consider giving it a thumbs up. I worked really hard on this one, so I hope you're enjoying it. The race mode is pretty simple. You can play through levels you've completed in the story mode with a partner, the goal being to get through it faster than them. This is great because if you don't want to compete, it also basically lets you play co-op. I can imagine there are plenty of people out there who probably had a blast playing this with their friends or siblings. In Rivals mode, you explore a map to collect runner's bags before the time runs out, and whoever has the most bags at the end wins. If combat is enabled, you can also do takedowns on your opponent to grief them and steal their bags. What I find most interesting about this mode is the map. It's unique to the mode and way more abstract than the rest of the game, being comprised almost entirely of red and white blocks floating in an endless blue void. It really reminds me of the Pure Time Trials DLC for Mirror's Edge. I wonder which one inspired the other. I was also surprised that each player can actually see the other player on their screen in these modes. Before getting this gameplay, I just assumed that each player would have their own instance of the map to run through. Again, I really want to thank Longplay Express, who specifically went out of their way to record this gameplay for me, as there's barely any footage of the multiplayer out there, and what exists is this guy literally using a camcorder to record his iPad. This was games journalism in 2010, folks. I really don't understand how it went further downhill from here. Obviously, I know that they probably didn't have phone recording software back then, okay chill, it's just a joke. But that's it for Mirror's Edge Mobile. Besides the story's presentation, if there was one thing I think the game could have done better, it would be to make some more visually unique levels. It does have a Storm Drains map, but most of the other levels either take place on extremely samey looking rooftops or extremely samey looking interior sections. I mean, take a look at these 4 different sections of gameplay. These are all from 4 different levels. But I'm not going to sit here and nitpick a game I didn't even play. Personally, the game looks kind of fun and for some reason gives me Temple Run vibes, even though they're pretty different gameplay wise. I'm just going to chalk it up to nostalgia being one hell of a drug. Speaking of nostalgia, for the next game we're going to need to go back even farther, to before the original Mirror's Edge was even released. Sometime in 2008, EA reached out to Brad Bourne, the creator of the Fancy Pants series, to create a Mirror's Edge Flash game. And I gotta say, coming across the Fancy Pants connection in my research was pretty neat. I mean, I probably played that like almost 15 years ago now. It just like unlocked core memories of being in the computer lab and constantly looking over my shoulder to see if a teacher was coming. And it's so weird to think that there's been a connection between that and Mirror's Edge this whole time. But beyond my philosophizing, it also speaks to how popular these Flash games were at the time, as EA evidently thought it would be worthwhile to collaborate with a Flash game dev to market their game. Nevertheless, Brad was definitely the right guy for the job, as Fancy Pants and Mirror's Edge emphasize similar elements in their gameplay, like fast and fluid momentum-based movement and precise platforming. Faith's movement is very fluid, and just like in Fancy Pants, the animations do a great job of conveying the momentum through the subtle ways that her body moves. Like Mirror's Edge Mobile, a lot of the moves from the main game, like sliding or wall running, have been adapted to the third-person perspective. One difference is how Faith can wall climb a lot, and I mean a lot. If you hold a directional key when jumping into a wall, you can climb like 2 or 3 more Faith lengths up the wall. It was a bit hard to understand at first, but once you get the hang of it, this really opens up a lot of paths, especially because you can repeatedly chain them with wall jumps. The levels are large and very vertical. You can go straight to the end rather fast, but if you take the time to explore, there are multiple routes you can take and collectibles like runner's bags to find. There are also little side rooms which serve as small puzzles where there's an enemy inside and you have to grab a document and leave while avoiding being shot too many times. Unfortunately, there's no combat system and you'll only see enemies in these special rooms. They also don't really have AI, they just kind of stand mostly stationary and shoot at you, which is a little bit disappointing. Overall, there are 3 levels in the game. One takes place on the rooftops, which really have that classic Mirror's Edge aesthetic. The next level also takes place among apartment buildings, but has much more of a general aesthetic, and you're mainly going between buildings below the rooftop level. So there's a lot of emphasis on wall climbing and wall jumps here. The last one is a sewer/storm drain level, and it really reminds me the most of the Fancy Pants games, just a pretty visually sparse area with a ton of platforms, slides, and vertical routes to explore. Sadly, the game ends at the end of this level with a cutscene rather than any sort of boss fight like the other Fancy Pants games. It's quite abrupt, and I wish there was just something here to tie the experience off. The game doesn't really have a story, so I can see how this would be kind of difficult though. Maybe there could have been some sort of unique puzzle that changes up the gameplay from the first few levels, like having to collect a certain amount of items within a time limit. After playing the main game, you can play speedrun mode, which, surprise surprise, is the same 3 levels with a speedrun timer. The other mode here is Baddie Rush, which just chains those extra document rooms together, giving you 60 seconds to get through as many as you can. Every time you collect a document, you get 10 more seconds. The order of the levels is the same each time, so it really just becomes about mastering the details of each route, which is fun for a bit, but it didn't really hook me, and I think it would have been more interesting and less repetitive if the levels were randomized. And after playing Fancy Pants World 1 and 2 in preparation for this video, I have to say that I think they're still better than this game. The lack of a lot of little things like the boss fights, a physics system, or enemies in the overworld environment really makes Mirror's Edge 2D feel a lot more flat, I guess is the word I'd use to describe it. But to be fair, maybe the versions of World 1 and 2 I played were more recently updated and don't reflect what they were like in 2009. Regardless, this game seems to have a pretty big impact on other areas of Brad's work. The partnership with EA for this game seemed to open up the door for future projects, notably a console port of Fancy Pants World 1 and 2, which also expanded the amount of content in each. So even if Mirror's Edge 2D wasn't a smash hit, it definitely helped his main series of games reach a wider audience. Another thing I realized during my research was that 2D was technically the first ever Mirror's Edge game that was playable on PC. Though Mirror's Edge 2D would be officially completed in late February 2009, EA must have reached out to Brad much earlier in the Mirror's Edge development process. As we can see on Brad's website, a playable beta for Mirror's Edge 2D was made available on November 11th, 2008, the same day that Mirror's Edge was released to consoles. And since the Mirror's Edge PC port only came out in January 2009, this means that for a while, the Mirror's Edge 2D beta was the only Mirror's Edge game PC exclusive players could play. However, if you're trying to play it nowadays, it's a little bit harder than in 2009. At the end of 2020, Microsoft ended support for Flash Player in all browsers, which Fancy Pants and this Mirror's Edge game and a lot of other browser-based games were built with. But even though Flash was killed, luckily people have put in a huge effort to preserve these games. I used a program called Flashpoint to play Mirror's Edge 2D as well as the Fancy Pants games. Flashpoint has a massive catalog of Flash games that you can just download and instantly boot up. If you're from my generation, I encourage you to give it a try and enjoy your trip down nostalgia lane. Hey, congrats, you made it to the end of the video. If you found this interesting and want a video about random games every month, consider subbing to the channel. I basically just cover everything that I find cool, even if the algorithm doesn't really like that. This video is definitely a bit different than my normal reviews. It was a lot more research based rather than gameplay focused. It was pretty fun and nostalgic trying to find all this info, going through old YouTube videos and articles. I mean, remember when internet articles would have multiple pages? I practically forgot that used to be a thing. Also, if you're wondering, there was no green screen because that just adds a ton of work behind the scenes, and I'm super busy in real life recently, but it will come back sometime in the future. But anywho, that's it for me today. Stay safe, and I will see you guys soon with some more artisanal, homebrewed gaming content.